With the reboot we saw the return of many of our favorite old school units, but this time they look better than ever before. And today I want to go over the biggest changes some of these cards went through from Wave 1. So let's see which were the best retrains of Wave 1. Stand up! Vanguard! Before we start, I want to clarify that I'm not basing this on the power of the new units in the current format for standard or premium. I'm only looking at the changes in power from the original to the new retrain version. Also, I'm excluding all VRs as that would be a bit unfair, and I just did a video about the best VRs in Wave 1, so check that one out if you haven't seen that already. I'm also excluding all old vanilla cards, as that would be a bit unfair, as almost all the new versions of the vanilla cards are 10 times better than their previous counterpart. And of course, this video is completely my personal opinion, but I'm certain I will be getting some of your favorites correct, as some cards are obvious includes in any list. So with that said and done, let's start this video. Tetra Magus was your typical archetype perfect guard from way back in the old days, but with Miss Mist already revealed as the drop PG and Rogue Magus as the normal grade 1 perfect guard, makes you think, what can they do to reimagine Tetra Magus for the reboot? Well, it came as a big surprise when they revealed that Tetra Magus evolved from this card into this card. Tetra Magus turned from one of the more defensive cards in one of the more aggressive cards we've seen in Vanguard. Very rarely can we stack the deck with cards of our choosing. So far it's only been done by a handful of cards, and usually it's with big boss monster cards. Tetra is a very unique card as it does one thing, but actually you can do two things with her. Her skill allows you to draw a card and then put a crit trigger on top of your deck from your hand. But what you can also do is just plainly draw a card, as her skill doesn't force you to put a crit trigger from your hand on top of your deck. Turning Tetra Magus into a very highly aggressive card make this one of the more extreme retrains. Knight of Friendship K was your typical 10k grade 1 attacker that most archetype got access to. In this case, it belonged to the Blaster archetype. It was also part of the Knight pair with Bedivere, as in all iterations, their card design was two parts of one artwork. And in Bedivere's case, he was the typical 12k grade 2 attacker with the same claws as K. So how did they evolve these cards that were part of the same archetype and were paired in a very unique way? Well, they finally turned them in actual pairs like so. Not only did they retain the overlapping artwork, they actually synergized together where one can call out the other, and they both got the same old power boost if they work together. Even though they don't directly work with the Blaster archetype, they still are Blaster Blade's best allies, because you can combo a Bedivere into a K, which in its own right can cause a Bedivere. This helps Blaster Blade significantly, as you can get his crit on a way more consistent basis thanks to these new cards. This spot goes to K more as Bedivere, as K is a more consistent card as it allows you to spear call Bedivere from the deck instead of just calling it from your hand. Also, K can be used as a super early aggression tool, as you can just superior call a Bedivere on turn 1 while you're still at grade 1. And all that comes from an old school 10k beater makes this a very awesome retrain. Arrestor was an underpowered grade 2 with a very awkward skill that needed left Arrestor. Yeah, you actually needed to call him to the right column and left Arrestor to the left column to only turn both 8k attackers into 11k attackers. Definitely one of the more weaker 2-card combos, so it isn't hard to imagine an upgraded version of the cards. But nobody could have seen what happened next, as he evolved into this card. Not only did he no longer need to be called to a certain part of the field, he also gained an insane skill that, combined with left Arrestor and Zanbaku, made your opponent almost rage quit the game, as they effectively needed to skip a turn. Yes, he still had a very specific condition and had a pretty heavy increase in skill cost, but at the same time it is more than worth it. Arrestor is a pretty insane card, but because it still retained the specific condition, and that coupled with the fact that his own skill isn't really that powerful on its own, as seen as it still relies on the power of the Zanbaku right lock, made me decide to put it lower on the list. But the fact that such an awkward card could be changed in the source of so many traumas make this one hell of a retrain. Beast Deity Scarlet Bird was the support card for Azure Dragon. It could find you your right target, but also the copies for the Personal Blast cost, as the old Azure Dragon had a skill which requires that it discarded himself. The problem with this card was that it wasn't all that consistent. It had an unhit effect and only checked the top 5 of your deck. So in terms of a retrain, you could imagine something how it could be upgraded, but no one saw this new version coming as Scarlet Bird turned into this card. Not only does this card synergize with Azure Dragon again, it also is an insane card for the whole archetype, and maybe even the clan in general. And on top of all that, it can also give you a +1. But more importantly, he is a consistent unit which you have full control over, unlike the previous version. Scarlet Bird is not only a very insane engine piece, it's also a pretty good counter card, because the card stands all units. That means including your Vanguard. So it's a perfect counter card against Sambaku, and in terms of premium, it's also a very good counter against Mega Colony. It's a handy tool that eliminates all those pesky annoying skills that sometimes stop you in your tracks. And all that makes this a pretty good retrain. Rising Phoenix was one of the few hard pluses Narukami had, but it came with a heavy cost. It cost 2 soul, which wasn't something Narukami had a lot of, and it also was on a 5k body, which didn't help the card at all. So in terms of retrain, this card could use all the help it could get. So when Bushiroad showed its evolved form, things became crazy because it changed into this card. This new version of Rising Phoenix is pretty insane. It is a free plus that can be used multiple times throughout the game. It can revive itself every time you bind something. And fun fact, Narukami tends to do that a lot. But not only that, it becomes an 11k grade 1, which in an Exoc deck is a very important number, as it can turn a 12k grade 3 into a 23k attack. Rising Phoenix has so much more potential than it is written on the card. You can guard with it early game to get some free extra shield out of it. You can also keep calling on top of it to reposition it on the board where you want to, and also gain the plus 3k each and every turn you do so. You can also use it as a mid-battle multi-attack tool, and it's amazing against control. And what's more important about this card is that the fact that the longer the game progresses, the more value you're going to get out of it, and the more support we're going to get, the better the card will become. And the fact that we came from a 5k grade 1 with a Soul Blast 2 draw 1 skill makes you wonder how insane some of these retrains can become. Jumping Jill was just like Bedivere, a 12k attacker. However, Jill had a different condition to it. It needed to be called from the soul to attain its power. This made it reliant on other cards for it to do something, and the power output was that it was a slightly stronger attack than other cards. But it had some use in earlier combos back in the day, so when we think of an evolved version of this card, we would assume it will rely on the deck's engine and it will benefit from it to push your opponent. However, we didn't think it would evolve into this card. Just like the previous version, it relied on the deck's engine to make the card work. But unlike the previous version, this card was also part of that engine and was the centerpiece of some insane combos you could do with the deck. Jumping Jill is a strong card that could do some nasty combos with Midnight Bunny, Alice and Purple Trapezes, and the fact that her skill works with the whole Axel Circle mechanic makes her a staple in a lot of decks. A card that benefited from an engine was turned into a centerpiece of the exact same engine, which in turn benefited herself because she was part of that same engine, if that makes any sense. And the fact that it does make sense makes it a pretty cool and strong retrain of an old school card. Aligos was a card which relied on the deck's engine to do its thing, just like Jumping Jill. But unlike Jill, even when he could do its thing, he wasn't that consistent as he needed to hit, which makes it not that great of a card and really made him a trial deck filler card. So when they announced him for a new trial deck, it wasn't that hard to imagine that he would be somewhat better. But nobody would imagine it would evolve into this card. Aligos changed from a somewhat useless card to the clan's most powerful and versatile staple cards. Not only could it restand itself, it could also restand other cards in the early game. This card single-handedly established the early rush for the deck, and it looks like it will become even better with the upcoming support for Wave 2. Aligos got the same treatment as Jumping Jill, as it turned into a centerpiece of an engine which it once was relying on. Remember Tidal Assault, how much of a staple that was for the clan itself? Now imagine that, plus an extra multi-tech skill that it could restand another unit in the early game. That's how big of a retrain this card was. Fantasy Battlestorm Shirayuki was a very strong defensive card which could help you survive your opponent's Vanguard's attacks, or a very strong rearguard attack. So with such a strong and solid card, it's hard to imagine a very impactful retrain that could overcome this version in terms of the reboot meta. But I think nobody would have guessed this new evolved form that turned out to be this card. They changed a solid defensive card in a card that not only could be used as an aggressive tool, but also give it some recursion value on the card itself. And not only that, they made the card splashable in any kind of build. Shirayuki made a deadly deck all the more deadly because both engines were splashable, which means that they are perfectly matched with each other. Different Fight even made a video talking about this card, how this could be a potential problem card for Vanguard. And that in itself says something about this retrain. Lie Down the Leader Given was an archetype specific card that worked with the engine it revolves around, and it gave the deck some pushing power, but it was a very limited card in power and couldn't work with other decks and mechanics, which limited in its potential. So when we knew it would get a retrain, we started imagining the potential it could have. But nobody could have seen that when this card would actually evolve into, as it turns into this card. This new card dropped all but one restriction, which in itself isn't really that much of a restriction. Also the fact that it could be used twice in a turn because you could discard it from your hand makes this card pretty damn strong in itself. But not only did this card establish a new strategy for premium, as you could have any Stride Vanguard restand when you ridden into Great Ult to delete your opponent's Vanguard, but it also synergized really well with the Messiah Strides, as most of them have some really powerful on-attack skills. That feat in itself makes this card a pretty insane retrain. Skullwitch in the main was a very awkward card. It could draw you 2 cards for the cost of a counterblast and a discard, so it was a +1, but it could really help you with the deck consistency. The only problem was that it was on a 3k body for a grade 2. So nobody, and I mean nobody, wanted to write this thing. So when this card would get a retrain, we would expect some weird power on the card with some kind of draw skill. However, we didn't expect it would evolve into this card. Not only did it become stronger while dropping in grade, it became the first card with a hard once per turn skill. And that was for obvious reasons, as her skill is pretty strong in Shadow Paladin. You could get 3 pluses each turn and fuel your sacrifice skills without losing your hand, and at the same time have some really insane early gain. But what we later found out was that she wasn't your average +1 searcher. She would become the new engine for Shadow Paladin, as Shadow Paladin would be getting a lot of these 5k grade 1s. We even saw some grade 2s that synergizes with this. The fact that some awkward grade 2 was turned into a new advantage engine for its clans makes this, in my opinion, one of the most insane retrains of Wave 1. And with that we conclude this list. Was I right? Did I include your favorites? Maybe I introduced you to some new ones? Or did I miss some of them in this list? Let me know in the comments down below what your favorites are for Wave 1. As always, I want to thank my patrons for supporting this channel. If you too want to support this channel, then head over to patreon.com/VanguardInsider and become a patron today. But with that said, I'm Mr. Time Leap, and I'll see you guys in the next one.